Picture a Viking warrior. Northern Norway, 850 AD. He wakes before sunrise. No alarm, no coffee, no protein shake. He eats what was caught the day before, fatty fish pulled from a river a mile away, fermented dairy from cattle grazing on wild grass, root vegetables dug from soil that has never seen a synthetic chemical. Everything he eats was alive within the last 24 hours. Everything came from within a day's walk. And here is what makes this genuinely uncomfortable. This man, with no doctors, no supplements, no government dietary guidelines, has roughly 50% more microbial diversity in his gut than you do right now. His bones show skeletal density that modern men in their physical prime rarely match. He will live a brutal life. But he will never hear the words chronic inflammation. He will never be told his testosterone is low. He will never develop type 2 diabetes. You have access to 40,000 products in a single supermarket. Nutritional labels, protein powders, omega-3 capsules, more food available to you than any civilization in history. And yet, men in the developed world are more inflamed, more hormonally disrupted, and more metabolically broken than at almost any point we can measure. This is not bad luck. It is not genetics. Your food was quietly hollowed out, and the people who did it got extraordinarily rich. That is what this video is about. And if what you are about to hear makes you angry, good. It should. Because the decision that changed your biology was not made in a laboratory or by a doctor. It was made in a boardroom. By men in suits, for profit, not for you. By the end, you will understand exactly what was taken, and more importantly, how to start taking it back. If you find this kind of thing useful, you know what to do. Before we get to who destroyed it, you need to understand what existed. Because the Viking isn't just a dramatic image to open with. He's evidence. What he ate was straightforward. Fatty cold water fish, herring, cod, salmon, often fermented. Wild game. Foraged plants. Fermented dairy called skyr, a dense high-protein yogurt. Nothing like what's in your supermarket fridge. Everything local. Everything seasonal. Eaten at peak ripeness because there was no alternative. The Vikings weren't unique. Medieval European farmers understood the same principle. Not because they'd read the science, but because the feedback loop was immediate and brutal. A farmer who destroyed his soil didn't get a warning letter from a regulator. He starved. So they rotated crops, rested land, maintained diversity because variety was survival. Here is the science underneath all of it. 1 teaspoon of healthy ancestral soil contains up to 1 billion living microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, and microscopic creatures that form networks so complex that scientists are still mapping them. They are the mechanism by which plants absorb minerals from the ground. Disrupt that network, and the plant loses access to the very nutrients it is supposed to deliver to you. The Vikings' food was dense with minerals because the soil it came from was alive. Your food comes from soil that is, in significant parts of the developed world, biologically dead. And the question you should be asking right now is, how did that happen? Because the answer does not start where you would expect. It does not start on a farm at all. It starts with the end of a war and a very inconvenient surplus of weapons. The Second World War is over, and somewhere in the industrial machinery of the Western world, a problem is quietly emerging. The factories that spent 6 years producing nitrogen-based explosives are still standing. The infrastructure is intact. The chemistry is understood. But nobody needs bombs anymore. So the question gets asked, what else can you do with a nitrogen factory? The answer was fertilizer. Synthetic nitrogen accelerates plant growth dramatically. You apply it to soil, and crops grow faster and bigger than ever before. You do not need to rotate crops. You do not need to rest the land. You do not need the careful generational soil management that ancestral farmers had refined over centuries. Just add nitrogen, and things grow. Yield goes up, cost goes down, The man whose chemistry made this possible was Fritz Haber, awarded the Nobel Prize in 1918 for discovering how to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. He was also the scientist responsible for developing chlorine and phosgene gas as chemical weapons in the First World War. Same man, same chemistry, different applications. Thomas Hager's book from 2008, The Alchemy of Air, tells his full story, and it is one of the most uncomfortable biographies in modern science. By the 1950s and 60s, this synthetic nitrogen revolution had been repackaged with a much more palatable name, the Green Revolution. It was funded by the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, backed by US government policy, and presented as a humanitarian project. The goal, officially, was to feed a growing global population, and yield did increase dramatically. But as documented in Raj Patel's Stuffed and Starved, what also increased, quietly, structurally, by design, was dependency. Farmers who had grown diverse crops on living soil for generations now needed to buy synthetic fertilizer, buy pesticides, and eventually buy seeds, all from the same companies providing everything else. This is exactly when Monsanto enters the picture. Monsanto did not start as a food company. It produced PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, now banned globally as persistent toxic pollutants for decades, while internal documents showed they knew about the health risks. They produced Agent Orange, the herbicide sprayed across Vietnamese forests by the US military, leaving behind a legacy of cancers and birth defects still being dealt with today. In 1974, Monsanto introduced Roundup, a broad-spectrum herbicide. It kills virtually everything it touches. Then, 22 years later, they introduced Roundup Ready seeds. These were crops genetically engineered to survive glyphosate while everything around them might. Farmers sprayed the herbicide, the weeds died, and the patented crops did not. And here is where it gets truly calculated. Those seeds were patented. That meant farmers could not do what farmers had done for 10,000 years, save seeds from this year's harvest to plant next year. They had to be repurchased every single season from Monsanto. The company was selling the herbicide, selling the only seeds that survived the herbicide, and legally preventing farmers from opting out of the cycle. In 2018, a California jury found glyphosate responsible for a groundskeeper's terminal cancer. Internal documents that emerged during the trial showed Monsanto had known about the potential risks for years. The case settled for nearly $300 million. It was not the last. While all of this unfolded in the private sector, the US government was finishing off what remained of small-scale farming. In the 1970s, Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz issued a directive that restructured American farming in a single phrase: get big or get out. Federal subsidies were redesigned to reward scale. Small, diversified family farms became economically unviable almost overnight. Between 1950 and 2000, the number of farms in the United States fell by 2/3. What replaced them were industrial monocultures so vast that local, seasonal, nutrient-dense food became structurally impossible. But the boardroom decisions are actually the easy part of this story to understand. What happened underground, in the soil itself, is where the real damage was done. And it is the part that connects directly to what is happening inside your body right now. Glyphosate, Roundup's active ingredient, is technically classified as a broad-spectrum antibiotic in its original 1974 patent. In practical terms, that means it does not just kill weeds. It kills bacteria, including the bacteria in soil and the living microbial networks that ancestral farming had spent centuries unknowingly preserving. A 2016 study published in Environmental Sciences Europe found glyphosate residue in 75% of air and rain samples tested across the American Midwest. It is not contained to the crops it is sprayed on. It has saturated the broader agricultural environment. The mycorrhizal fungal networks, the underground webs that transfer minerals from soil into plant roots, are highly sensitive to glyphosate. Disrupt those networks and the plant loses its primary mineral delivery mechanism. The crop still grows, and it still looks like food, but the nutritional transaction that made ancestral food dense has been severed. A 2004 study in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition analyzed 43 garden crops, comparing nutritional content in 1950 to modern equivalents. Same vegetables, same serving sizes. What they found was this: protein was down 6%, calcium was down 16%, iron was down 15%, and vitamin C was down 20%. A bowl of spinach in 1950 had roughly twice the iron of the same bowl today. And that gap between the food your body was built to run on and the food actually available to it is not an abstract nutritional statistic. It is landing inside your body in ways that are specific, measurable, and probably more personal than you would like. Let's make this concrete, because this is where it stops being a history lesson and becomes your problem. Iron deficiency is the most common nutritional deficiency on the planet. The World Health Organization estimates it affects around 2 billion people in a world producing more food than at any point in history. Subclinical iron deficiency, not severe enough to be diagnosed as anemia, but persistent enough to matter, is associated with cognitive decline, chronic fatigue, and a suppressed immune system. Magnesium is involved in over 300 enzymatic reactions: testosterone production, sleep quality, insulin sensitivity, blood pressure regulation. A 2018 review in Nutrients found approximately 50% of Americans consume less than the recommended daily intake, a mineral systematically stripped from soil by synthetic fertilizer over 70 years. Zinc, critical for immune function and testosterone, has declined by approximately 33% in wheat since pre-industrial farming, according to a 2017 study in Scientific Reports. And then there is what glyphosate does directly to your gut. The same bacterial pathway it disrupts in soil exists in your gut bacteria. A 2013 paper in the journal Entropy argued this disruption reduces production of tryptophan, a precursor to serotonin. The mechanism is biologically real. The downstream effects, disrupted mood, poor sleep, gut permeability, chronic low-grade inflammation, are consistent with what Dr. Mark Hyman documents in the blood sugar solution as the primary drivers of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and cognitive decline in the developed world. You are not imagining it. You are not just getting older. You are running on food that has been systematically stripped of what your body needs, and the people responsible have faced almost no consequences. Which raises the question, where were the people whose job it was to prevent this? Michael Taylor spent the 1980s as a lawyer for Monsanto. He then moved to the FDA. In 1993, he approved commercial use of RBGH, Monsanto's bovine growth hormone. That product was subsequently banned in the European Union, Canada, and Australia over health concerns. After that, Taylor returned to Monsanto as Vice President of Public Policy. He later moved back into government as the FDA Deputy Commissioner for Foods under the Obama administration. This is documented. Public record, detailed by Jeffrey Smith in Genetic Roulette and reported by the Washington Post. This is what regulatory capture looks like. A career trajectory. The people responsible for approving the safety of your food and the people profiting from that food system have been, for decades, the same people. In 2015, the World Health Organization classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans. In 2023, the European Union reapproved it for another 10 years. The reapproval relied substantially on safety data submitted by the manufacturers themselves. The US government currently spends around $20 billion a year in agricultural subsidies. The vast majority goes to corn, soy, and wheat monocultures. The diversified, nutrient-dense crops that ancestral farming was built on receive virtually nothing. This system was not captured overnight. It was built this way, deliberately, over 70 years, and it will not be fixed by a government petition. But it can be opted out of, starting now. You cannot dismantle Monsanto, but you can stop feeding the machine it built. And it does not require a lifestyle overhaul. It requires 4 decisions in order of leverage. The first is to know which foods matter most. The Environmental Working Group publishes the Dirty Dozen. Annually, 12 fruits and vegetables that consistently carry the highest pesticide loads in commercial testing. Strawberries, spinach, kale, peaches, apples. Start there. Farmers markets and community-supported agriculture boxes, where you pay a local farm directly for a weekly seasonal box, put you back in direct contact with food grown in living soil. The second is to eat with the season, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a nutritional one. Food harvested at peak ripeness in its natural growing window is measurably more nutrient-dense than food picked early, shipped thousands of miles, and ripened artificially. A tomato grown 20 miles away in August is a fundamentally different food from one shipped from Spain in December. The Viking had no choice about this. That constraint, it turns out, was one of the most important features of his diet. The third is to rebuild your gut. Research from the Human Food Project shows measurable improvements in gut microbiome diversity within weeks of reducing processed food and introducing fermented foods. Kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, live yogurt. These are not wellness trends. They are the modern equivalents of what the Viking ate by default. The fourth is to grow something yourself. Even 10% of your food grown in your own soil is 10% you control entirely. A container on a balcony. A community allotment. Herbs on a windowsill. The goal is not self-sufficiency, it is reconnection. Once you know what living soil smells like, what a vegetable tastes like when it has not spent a week in cold storage, you cannot unknow it. Go back to that Viking. The gap between him and you is not genetics. It is a series of decisions made between 1945 and 1980 by companies and governments whose incentives had nothing to do with your health, that systematically dismantled the food system, sustaining human biology for thousands of years, and replaced it with one optimized entirely for yield, shelf life, and profit. The body that ate ancestral food and the body eating industrial food are running different software on the same hardware. Your gut, your hormonal system, your inflammatory response, all of it still works exactly the way it was designed to. It still responds to real food, grown in living soil. That has not changed. That will never change. The soil can recover. The gut can recover. Studies show both. Neither one recovers through a supplement. Neither one recovers through a government policy. It starts with knowing what was taken, then making one different decision at the farmer's market, in the kitchen, in the ground outside your window, one meal at a time. Starting today. If this changed how you see what is on your plate, share it with someone who needs to hear it.